This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us via Zoom on WZRD Caroline Cabading. She is a jazz vocalist and a percussion instrumentalist, as well as a community activist and also executive director of the International Hotel in San Francisco. How are you, Caroline?
I'm doing well. How are you today, Trudy?
Oops, sorry. Caroline, could you I have my channel on the wrong setting. Could you repeat what you just said?
Oh, yes, I just said hello. I'm doing well, Trudy, and how are you?
Welcome, welcome. How so how were you inspired by this project? Was it a lifelong project? Was it on account of everything that you've seen since you were a girl, or is there also family history and documentation by your ancestors of everything that happened so that the family does not lose the history.
Yes, actually, it was a little bit of all of the above.
Caroline,
Oh,
I think. Hang on just a second. Okay, go ahead, Caroline. Sorry about that.
okay, wonderful. I think it's a little bit of all of the above, Trudy. It's like I've been studying music as a jazz musician for decades, as well as the ancestral music of the Philippines. And so the music came together along with a lifetime of talk story from my family that brought to life all of these interesting characters from my family line, and me as a fourth generation American Filipino, all of the stories of our resilience, of our tragedies and our joys were a part of our family talk story, and therefore our education and history as I was growing up with the rest of my cousins. So all of that came into being on this project, came together.
Mm. When so Sugilanan, does that mean story or does it mean talk a story?
It actually means story. So it's most the simple form, and it's patterned after the Philippine Kalinga tribes title of their epic poem, which is Di Ulalam, and that translates to story. So I thought that I would do the same thing with my suite, is that I would call it story.
Mhm. Yes, it's a wonderful album, and there's all the different songs have are parts of the entire whole. Did you set out to do it chronologically, or did you have maybe another pattern in mind when you started the project?
I actually did want to do it chronologically. I wanted to tell the story from the beginning with our first ancestor that immigrated to America.
Mhm.
And but on the other hand, it was a very interesting conversation with my producer, because if all of these stories, the songs were preceded by verses, an introductory verse, like how were we going to cut the album? Was it going to be like each introductory verse was connected to the song, or were they all separate? And how would that play if people related to the individual story or the individual song? So what we decided to do was we created 26 tracks, so each of the verses are separate from the actual song. So sometimes people just want to listen to the songs in whatever order they want to, but in terms of a concept album, it was sort of intended to go from beginning to end if you had the time.
Oh, it's hard to just listen to one track and stop. You just keep wanting to go on and on. When you wrote the story, wrote the songs, how did you decide what to put in English and what to put in your native language? And your native language, what is it called?
Okay, so there are actually represented in this album, there are four ethno-linguistic groups in the
Hmm.
Philippines. So just to make that very clear, is that the national language of the Filipinos is Filipino, but we
Hmm.
actually have over 100 distinct ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines, and they're not dialects; they're actually languages. So the language of the Kalinga people is one language, Kalinga. My own family, I actually am a mixed person. I come from the Ilocano people, and I also come from the Cebuano people.
Mhm.
And the music that I studied, in addition to the Kalinga music, is the music from Maguindanao, the Maguindanao people. That's the Kulintang gong ensemble. So we're all Filipino,
Mhm.
speaking many very different languages, and they were all, and because that's also my unique experience as a mixed Filipino, that I grew up hearing both languages in my household. So that is also my experience. I studied the music of two different linguistic groups, ethno-linguistic groups that were not even my own. So all four of them are represented in the album because it would be sort of appropriate. That was my life.
And are you fluent in all four languages?
I'm actually sad to say that I'm fluent in none of them. I'm learning. I'm starting to like relearn the language, and I have a trip to go back to the Philippines in July, and I need to shore up even my Tagalog. But I would say that I know a bit of like all of them, but then I can't hold a very good conversation. And luckily for me, because the Philippines was colonized by America, English, it's very easy to be lazy when I visit my motherland, is that everyone speaks English. So I have to, but that's bad on me. I need to learn more also.
What would you say your pronunciation is of the verses in your album? Because if you were to be speaking with an accent, we can't tell, but do your fellow Filipinos tell you if you sing with an accent or not?
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. I as part of like my studies as a student of ancestral Philippine music,
Mhm.
one of the ways that an American person, keeps herself honest in terms of like the teaching is that I go back almost every year.
Mm.
With the exception of COVID, to go back to my culture bearer teachers to make sure that the music that I'm playing, even the percussion, is sounding correct, and
Mhm.
also the phonetics of my how I pronounce the songs and stuff like that are actually correct, and they are corrected. So in order to do them justice, I have to sing or chant or play in the proper accent that the people understand as being appropriate. So I go back every year to be honest,
Oh.
and not get too loose. Being here in America, that I get loose. It's like, so that's how I basically uh just make sure that I'm stewarding this tradition appropriately.
Do you practice, or do you just are you able to have some conversations in this language with others during that time that you are not going back and having that refresher course?
Not so much the
Mm.
a full conversation.
Hmm.
It's more like it's an understanding more deeply of the relationship of the lyrics that I'm using and choosing, and also just the references of the words. So it's the Philippines is extremely fluent in all kinds of languages, and because there's so many ethno-linguistic groups, they have to decide on certain common languages that they speak. And this region where I'm studying, which is Kalinga, that whole region of the rice terraces, all of these tribes, they also speak Ilocano as the common language. So, and as in the central part of the Philippines, the country also knows how to speak Filipino or Tagalog.
Hmm. And so your percussions, is that American percussion style that you've learned, or is it Filipino percussion?
Filipino percussion. And I always like to
Ah.
make it really clear that when people say, is this inspired by the Maguindanao Kulintang ensemble or inspired by the Kalinga bamboo ensemble, I actually correct them, and they actually are informed. I like to use that word informed because
Mhm.
the musical the melodic and the rhythmic motifs that I'm using in there, be it Kulintang or Kalinga, is actually what the people play. So there, I'm actually the compositions that my new compositions took the precedence was in the bed of how the Kalinga people and the Maguindanao people feel about their music, and then on top of that, I created melody and lyrics. So they were that is what led. It was their feel. the way that those instruments have played the rhythms for centuries. And I wanted to honor that. So it was definitely informed by how the people play the music back home.
Was it difficult for you to combine to get to make your tracks informed by uh, the native way of playing and you combine several genres into the album. Could you explain about that as well?
Yes, it was in a way it was challenging
Mhm.
because there is, unlike something like our instruments like a guitar or piano, there aren't several octaves and there, and you can't really play around with keys because the gong ensembles are set sounds, and the bamboo too, they're set sounds. But also it was not so hard because I think that I was working with I've been studying this music for over 20 years.
Mhm.
So I know how to respect it. I know how to build around it. And I also was working with a bunch of like wonderful musicians that were coming from that respect. They were all Asian American artists that understood that we were respecting an Asian tradition. And they wanted, even though they were jazz musicians, they wanted to make it fit and to make it appropriate. And one of the ways that has been most challenging is that for the Kalinga people, they think in 7 and not 8, like we
Mm.
do in the Western world. But after a while, you get used to feeling 7. So it was, and they just sort of they took that extra step in challenge to honor the tradition. So I'm very honored to have worked with these musicians that understood the role. It was not to try to make Asian music more Western. It was to make the Western music we grew up with here in America to honor the Asian motifs.
Wow. So if it's not by the eighth, by octaves, then what is the seven called?
Oh, it's like it's not an, I think they don't even have a name for it, but
Oh.
basically what it is that it's a circular kind of music. So as we go from do re mi fa sol la ti do, and then we keep going up in the scale, it's basically the same. So do re mi, but you
Mhm.
get into different octaves like doubles. What they do, it's a circle of the same. So 7 becomes 1 again. So in some ways it is like 8, but then but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 goes back to 1. And
Mm.
there's a very circular feel to this music. It's a constant circle as opposed to going up and going down. It's not linear, it's circular.
Mm. And
Yeah, it's hard to
yeah,
explain.
but it's really very, very unique, your album. There's the very simple rhythm, but that is very catchy.
Yeah.
And then I could kind of hear that circular. Every song is different, but then there's that skeleton, that's like skeleton that keeps it all together.
Yes. And one of the things that, we don't really hear in the album, but is actually true in the culture is that there's a total, of the 7 instruments, each individual person, there are actually 6 instrumentalists that are playing just one rhythmic uh, uh, phrase,
Mm.
and all together it becomes the whole ensemble. So it's almost as if so in other words, this, you have to have real team building. There isn't like a prima
Mm.
donna at the front who's like, everyone's following him or her. It's
Mhm.
everyone has, there's no ego. We're playing as a community, and everyone has a certain part that if you fall off of your part, if you are not listening, if you are not playing like a village or a community, the whole thing falls apart. So it's a different kind of mentality that is very, in my, as I see it, very non-Western. It was the biggest challenge for American born and raised musicians to actually put aside all ego, and you played as if you were one instrument. And that
Mhm.
was what goes on with the Kalinga ensembles.
Wow. How did Wayne Wallace work with you on this album?
Oh, he was wonderful. Oh my God, I was so thankful for him. Basically, um, and it was great because he's not an Asian American. He's
Mhm.
not Filipino. So he was coming from this perspective of just like an amazing jazz musician who also understood about ethnic music because, he's a wonderful Latin jazz, musician. And
Mhm.
so he would come in with an objective, like I'm objective, I'm not from your culture. Like, let me ask you these questions about why are you making these choices? And would you be open to maybe looking at it in a different way? Because I'm also coming at it from years of jazz music experience and seeing world music on a bigger level, and also as an outsider. So we would have these wonderful conversations simply because he was not entrenched in Philippine music, and he was able to help me see outside of the box and just really level up the album as the best that it can be. And it was wonderful to work with him. He was my teacher in school when I was at the jazz school in Berkeley, California. So it was like having the honor of like your former teacher being your producer. And so we had a relationship as student and teacher for many years previous. So I was tickled that he was willing to be my producer on this. I was very honored, actually.
And you sought him out, right? Asked him for advice and asked him to be your producer?
Yes. He was my first choice. He was, because of everything that I had ever learned, from him, the fact that he's also local San Franciscan, and such an icon in the Latin jazz and world music world. He was my first choice, and I was keeping my fingers crossed that because he does so many wonderful projects around the world, that he might find room for me. And he said right away yes, and so I was thrilled, and I knew I was in good hands at that point.
Mhm. How many different genres are combined into this? There's the native Philippine kind of is it at all like the Philippine music? I'm sorry to say that I haven't listened to a lot of Filipino music, so I don't know how that music compares with your album. Uh,
Sure. Yeah, it's very interesting. We have a very interesting history as colonized people. So
mhm,
I would say it's indicative of pre-colonial ancestral music of the Philippines.
mhm,
Not necessarily what is popularly known in the Philippines because of the strong
okay.
influence of America and the Spanish. So a lot of what you might hear when you listen to Philippine music has a lot of the Spanish influence, particularly from the colonial times. That is what most of the Philippines even understands as being Filipino music. The
Mhm,
rondalia, even the melodies and the songs, and very Western, actually. Western Spanish is sort of like where most of this music comes from.
mhm,
It's different in the sense that I'm actually reaching back older to like a pre-colonial, and with ethno-linguistic groups that live more in isolation from the
mhm.
mainstream Manila community. So I would think that it sounds a little bit different. But if you were to go to the tribal lands, to the villages, this is what they hear.
Oh,
This is Filipino to them.
mhm. So it's kind of like folk music, or it can even be, it could be categorized as a folk music a
Yeah,
little?
I like to call it ancestral music.
Okay, yes.
This is what we sounded like before the visitors and the colonizers came and affected our lives.
Mhm,
This is what I like to feel the Kalinga people living high in the mountain where the rice terraces were. This is how they heard nature. This is how they heard music. And way in the south, where the Maguindanao Kulintang ensemble is, that is how they heard nature. That is how they heard music in their heart. Um, and we all know that that is how for people who are from the land, that's how music develops. It's the music that you hear in nature. It's
mhm,
the music that is has a relationship to your culture and your ethics and the ways and your values. It all music is beautiful in that way, that it all comes to play, especially when you start bringing things in like vocal music and lyrics. When you bring in the words, that pretty much really solidifies what a people are by what they say and sing to each other.
mhm. So in other words, the ancestral music is uh, based on living on the land, because your ancestors were mostly farmers, right? And then the land was like everything to them.
Yes. Yes, I think that or even before that, hunter gatherers, but really with the two groups
Mhm,
that I'm working with, Maguindanao and Kalinga, even today the land is very important, and
mhm,
the village cohesion is
mhm.
very, your sense of kinship and working as one community is very important. But yes, land is very important. And the sounds that you hear in nature, the two musics, Binalig, which is track number 2 of the Kulintang Ensemble of the South, is a very different feeling. It's influenced even by who was more south as our neighbors, like Indonesia, Malaysia, all of that, all of that influence is there. But the Kalinga, the bamboo music that you hear, comes from the very top, the north, and we're more influenced by being in mountains as opposed to
Mm,
being ocean, and also our a relationship with Taiwan, the
mm,
Aboriginal Taiwan people. And
mhm.
so that's what's so interesting about such a tiny country, is that because the regions were influenced by two directions, you have a very distinct sounds, in their choice of how they express themselves in song and music.
How did you first becoming acquainted with the sound?
Thank you. That's a great question. My family first came to America in 1904. I'm a fourth generation Filipino San Franciscan, which means that either, at one point the family gets assimilated into American culture, or you start seeking and figuring out, why do we identify ourselves as Filipino American 4 generations later? And I chose that latter. So I always knew I was a musician. I loved, jazz, but then I started thinking, well, what does it mean to be a Filipino if I have not really been from that country for 4 generations now? And because I'm a musician, I thought I could find that answer through music. So over 20 years ago, when I was still, a student, I was trying to seek out whether Philippine music resonated with me. And I was very lucky that a Kulintang master artist immigrated to America and happened to live in San Francisco. So I
Mhm,
found my master teacher who had a direct connection to the Southern Philippines, and was under his study, and was and one of his touring musicians and dancers until he passed away. And then when he did pass away, I continued my studies because I already knew, like, that I love this music. But then I wanted to expand a little bit more and say, what have I not been studying for 20 years that can even bring me deeper into the Philippine experience? And so I went to the opposite direction. I went north to the
mhm,
mountains, and that's where I fell in love with the Kalinga bamboo instruments and that culture. So I
mhm,
sought it out, and I was right. I found a lot of wonderful foundation in who I was to make me stronger as an American, a minority American, really,
mhm,
here in America, because I had a sense of roots, and now I understood for real why my family was always proud to say they were Filipino American, because we came from such lovely art, and particularly music.
mhm. How did you find that master that I know it was lucky that he immigrated to the US, but how did the two of you connect?
That's a great story too. It's like I was when I was very young, I was already like liking music, and anything that was connected to music I sort of wanted to be around. And so I was a docent, and we called them explainers at the Exploratorium in San Francisco. It's this science museum, and
Mhm,
they had like this one exhibit that was like a music exploration stage. And every now and then, like once a month, they would have a really cool musician or sound
mm,
artist come in, and I was like one of the stagehands, and so he comes in, and he's saying, this is a master artist of Kulintang music, Tanongan Kalanduyan, and then I'm just here as like one of his stagehands. And when I heard the music for the very first time, and when I was growing up, I never really liked rondalia or the Spanish derived music. It was beautiful, but it didn't speak to me. So I didn't relate to it. When I heard this music, I had never heard of this gong music, but something in my heart, like my DNA, it remembered it. And
mhm,
that is really like how I felt. I go, I remember this. I don't know how I'm hearing it for the first time, but I remember this. And immediately afterwards, I said, how can I study with you? And
Mm-hmm.
then that started the relationship. That was fate, that was destiny. I happened to be a stage manager, a stage hand,
Mm-hmm.
for one of his shows, and that's how I found him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I
so
never.
the other Filipino music did not resonate with you because it was too tinged with the Western influences, but this was pure. It was truly ancestral, and that was what drew you to it.
Yeah, because really, a Filipino person, I appreciated the fact that we had, we were singing with guitars and we had
Mm-hmm.
Spanish language, and we could read Western music, but I was going, really, was that how we started? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
it's like it seems like that was something that was influenced, in our culture. So to see something that was like, this was really the instruments that we built, in the natural world. This was the sounds and the melodies that we put together in the real world. These are the instruments we invented. That was different. That was
Mm-hmm.
so different. And I really felt it. And I felt like, now I'm coming home.
It
And from
was
here, I can move forward.
was the sound simpler and purer?
It was both, because this is it was not complex in the sense of like Western music having octaves, and things like that. And you can, and but it was very more complex because it's polyrhythmic. It has the beats that we break down in Western music. This music has even more, it's almost like Indian music. They have like the rhythmic breakdowns are even more precise, and it's microtonal, meaning that what we recognize in the Western world as intervals, um, there's tinier intervals,
Mm-hmm.
the minor second, the major second, that's what we understand. But in there are tones that are not even recognized in Western music. So you have to get used to a different ear, a different way that in Western ears you might think that's off tune, but then it's beautifully in tune for these cultures. And so polyrhythmic music, where there was very complex interlocking rhythms, and microtonal music where the melodies, where the individual sounds were smaller than what we know in Western music. Those were all very new, but they felt comfortable at the same time. I was going, no, like my husband, who's a Western musician,
Mm-hmm.
also Filipino, but then he had to quit taking class because he was going, oh, I'm a guitar player, and it's like it's throwing off what I think in Western music as being in tune. He couldn't continue, but I kept going.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Let's get back to the history. So you, uh, of course, there are so many facets to one person's life. How did you choose that specific part of, let's say, your great grandmother's life, or your grandmother, your mom, to embody in a song?
Oh, thank you. That's a good question too. What I decided to do was I was going through the line of Americans, and so it started with the first American, Maximo, and then his my great grandmother, Julia, and that was the first generation. And then so I went down that line, and on my maternal side, I'm American. So I was born here. My mother was born here. My grandmother was born here, and then my grandmother's parents were the first immigrants. So that was the storyline that we grew up hearing as cousins, and great grandchildren, was the immigrant story, and it was that maternal line. So those are the characters we knew all the time, because my family talked about them all the time. And
Oh,
my great grandparents, for example, I never met them. They died before I was born, but because the stories were so vibrant, I always felt like I knew them. And that's how my family were big storytellers. So they would tell these stories, whether they were tall tales or what, but we always knew where we came from and who we came from. And then there's more story that would come from my father's side or even my grandfather. But then this was the line that I decided to explore, is the immigrant story,
mhm.
my American immigrant story.
Is Filipino culture a more uh, maternalistic, or is it that you just chose the maternal side for this album and maybe we'll have a paternal side album in the future?
Right, exactly. Well, see, it's for me, it's really it was just the coincidence that was my family.
Hmm.
On my maternal side, I am American by 4 generations, and each of the women who were born here, they married immigrant Filipino men. So that's why it was like that. It was like, I'm born here, my mother's born here, her mother's born here, and then my great grandparents came. So it was coincidence. On the other hand, I will have to say that my family is very matriarchal. It's like,
Yes, Mr. Edo, yeah,
yeah,
that's what I
and,
want
and
to say.
and I
Yeah.
don't necessarily think that's Filipino. I think with tribal Filipino people, when I visit the tribal lands, I feel like that there's more equal equality between the two genders. But definitely in my family, it was matriarchal in the sense that women had a lot of voice. Women had a lot of power in the family and were encouraged to be um, all that they wanted to be. So it was a wonderful way to grow up, that I wasn't stunted for being female, but actually celebrated, because I came from a long line of like female generals. I would like to say that, they
Mhm.
determined the education of the children. They worked the budget. They some of them even like went beyond housewife and had jobs, went to college, that type of thing. So they were amazing role models.
Mhm. There was that struggle in a Filipino town, and could you talk a little bit about that, about the I Hotel, and how, uh, and let's say in 1977, what part did you have in that when they bulldozed the I Hotel?
Thank you. It's I am connected to that story, which is the reason why it's an important story, not only because I'm the executive director of the International Hotel Manila Town
Mm-hmm.
Center now, but because my family is actually related. And that's actually the reason why I decided to be the executive director. My grandfather, when he immigrated to America in the 1930s, he lived in SROs and on Kearney Street that were very similar to the International Hotel. So I am from that neighborhood, and so to speak. The generation afterwards, my uncle and aunt, they were part of the human chain that defended the International Hotel, and now I'm the next generation, and I help to maintain and steward that history and legacy. The Filipino community, and as well as the Asian American community here in San Francisco, we see this as one of the key events in our history in which we took a stand to determine our own destiny instead of letting outsiders determine our destiny for us. And for Filipinos, that's a very big deal, because we have gone through centuries of being colonized, of our culture being taken away, being buried, being lost. And also coming to this this American experience for many of them was to become stoop labor, and basically to be a cheap workforce. So other entities just decided what our lives were going to be like. And but the I Hotel was about the community coming and saying, no, it's not right to throw out our elders in the street, without any provision, for their care afterwards. And we are going to create a human chain around this building to prevent that eviction from happening. What was also birthed at that time on a wider level was Asian American consciousness, in which, like, all of our groups, instead of saying we're very different, like how we see that in Asia, Japanese Americans, Vietnamese, Filipino, Chinese Americans, all of the Asians said, you know what, we have a common experience in this country, solidified together, and knowing that we have more in common than different, we will be stronger. And so this became an Asian American struggle, and it also became the development of Asian American consciousness as an activism consciousness. So and all of that is birthed in the International Hotel struggle of 1977. I was a small child, so I was not involved, but then my family was. I feel my bloodline was involved. So when I am the steward of it, it's like I'm the steward also of my home, because San Francisco is my home. Chinatown, which is now Chinatown because Manila Town is gone. Chinatown is my home. It's my local neighborhood, and my family, my DNA runs there too. With my American family that has literally lived, where the International Hotel stands.
Well, they tore it down, and then what were you able to have in its place? What you tried to, your uncles, that generation tried to keep them from bulldozing it, but eventually they still tore it down. They still raised it. So what took its place, and how did the current International Hotel come into being?
It's a very interesting story because the thing is, they did get, it changed the, uh, they were evicted.
Dialogue?
That's yeah. So the sad story is that yes, the elders were evicted, and yes, the owner of that building demolished the building. He wanted to build a parking lot, but the thing about it is that already what was put into place was a movement about affordable housing and tenants' rights.
Mhm.
And every time that something would try to get built, the city of San Francisco would reject it. Like it became like that hole in the ground, literally a hole in the ground on Jackson and Kearney, was so sacred to what it represented for the San Francisco Asian American and Filipino community, that any attempt to make it a commercial space was really rejected, and you could really do nothing with that space. So that almost 20 years later, basically 20 years later, what it was sold to the city of San Francisco, and it became the only thing that it could become. It should become space for the people. So what, with the help of the Archdiocese of San Francisco, the Chinese American community, and the Filipino American community, and the city of San Francisco, um, and HUD, Housing and Urban Development, the federal agency, they rebuilt the International Hotel to provide 106 apartments for low-income seniors, and then also my center, which is the museum or the gathering space that remembers the legacy.
Mhm.
So it got rebuilt. It got rebuilt because of community, to be
Mhm.
honest with you. But it took a very long time. It was like for decades, literally a hole in the ground. And the big tragedy, of course, is that if you had allowed these elders to age in place, and then the owner of that building probably would have got exactly what he wanted. In time, they would have aged in place, they would have passed away, you would have an empty building, you could demolish it and build a parking lot. But instead, it was meant to be a part of history in which, the greediness of wanting to kick old people out into the street started a movement. And all that that space could be is what it was always intended to be, a home for our elders.
Mhm. Oh, were those elders mostly Filipino, or were they other ethnicities as well?
They were mostly Filipino, and also, great. Some of them were also Chinese American,
Mhm. What
maybe
happened? Yeah, go
Filipino.
ahead.
Yeah, about maybe two-thirds Filipino, and
Uh-huh.
also, and then the rest mostly Chinese American, and then miscellaneous. They were also it was a huge building, so it also, amongst its tenants, were like some very important agencies that were, or organizations that were important to the Asian American community, like the Kearney Street Workshop, the International Hotel Tenants Association, Club Mandalay. So there were businesses too that were, the People's bookstore, which would become East Wind Books, the iconic Asian American bookstore. So who was getting evicted were some of our most important organizations in the Asian American community as well.
Where did the elders and these organizations and businesses go after the mill building was demolished?
Yeah, that's actually one of the sadder stories. It's like, there are different stories for different people. Some were able to get spaces in the remaining SROs that were still in Chinatown, like the St. Paul. Some passed away very soon after that event. One could say from failed health as elders. You could also say from a broken heart. It's
Mhm.
like you were kicked out of your home, and some of them died rather quickly. Relatively, they passed away. Some of them even left, California, and the businesses, that some businesses just disappeared, and then some, continue to exist in other locations. Kearney Street Workshop still exists, for example. Um, and then, of course, our organization as well. It became the International Hotel Tenants Association became the Manila Town Heritage Foundation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So my organization, which is now the manager or the steward of the International Hotel Manila Town Center, was the our ancestor organization was the IHTA.
Mhm. Do you have any data about how many people were living in the International Hotel versus yeah, well, just before it got demolished, and the number of people that are living on that land now, just the numbers between then and now. Do you have those?
Ooh, I do know for sure we have about 106 living there now. So
Mhm,
the wait list to get on our beautiful international hotel scene, because they're so beautiful. They're lovely apartments. They're modern. We take care of our elders and lots of social events for them and lots of care and protection of them. 106 with like hundreds on the waiting list. You know, who if
mm,
an apartment frees up. Back then, I don't know the exact number offhand, but maybe we're thinking it was maybe similar. I'm trying to recall. I have all of the names. If you come to visit my center, all of the names are listed, but I never thought to count them. But I'm thinking they were about a similar amount as well, maybe a little bit more.
Was the old International Hotel an SRO, or was it some of them were apartments so that a larger group of people, like a family, would be able to live there? What was it? It was a hotel. It was called a hotel. Was it an actual hotel, or was it just the name?
Yeah, actually, it's a very old hotel that, back in the day in the early, I think it was built in 1830.
Mhm,
At that time, because of course our culture was different, it was considered a very fancy five-star hotel.
mhm,
So it had that kind of history. But back then, all of the hotels, including the Palace Hotel, all of the wonderful, old hotels in our big cities, they were hotels in the sense that you had a room.
mhm,
But then back in those days, you didn't have a kitchen or anything like that because it was a hotel. You just had a room, but each floor had a common bathroom. So that was how this hotel was built. When So it was built to be like a hotel, like the Hyatt or the Hilton or something like that. When it converted into an SRO, which is a single resident occupancy apartment, the apartments didn't stay, they didn't change. They stayed as hotel rooms with common bath area and
mhm,
then one giant common kitchen area. So there was a lot of like mingling among the tenants that especially when it came to food, that they were sharing, a giant kitchen, and they oftentimes ate together and socialized together. Much different from an modern apartment building. Now,
mhm,
the new International Hotel is a modern apartment building. So
mhm,
they have their own bathroom, within their studio or one bedroom, their own kitchen. But
mhm,
we also created, in the spirit of the old I Hotel, a common, almost like social room. So you have the option to take, lunch meals with everybody else, and on the third floor community room,
mhm,
for a very discounted price. I think it's only $2 for seniors to have lunch,
mhm,
and so you can be social if you want to, even though you have your own kitchen and bathroom.
mhm. And do you find that most of the seniors are socializing?
I believe they are, although our makeup is now different because we now it's flipped over. It's like almost two-thirds is monolingual Cantonese,
Mm,
and maybe then the smaller is everybody else, including Filipinos. And so that's the difference. And this group of monolingual Cantonese, yes, they're very they have lots of social events. And even sometimes their families visit too, also very different. Like in the 70s, we were talking about a bachelor society that was
mhm,
had no real family other than themselves, and now we have like elders living there, but they have like their world is bigger. Their world is bigger because it's today, where there's so much more that you can do and get around in the city.
mhm. Well, during the Bachelor Society, the men, they just practically just work and maybe socialize a little bit with other coworkers and then went to bed because there was a long workday ahead.
Yeah, when they were young men, because the SROs were actually, this is where even the young worker men would stay when they were in town. They were doing that whole circuit from Central California farming through
Mm,
San Francisco, Stockton, and then going all the way up to Alaska to work in the canneries. They were a migratory workforce. And when they happened to come to San Francisco, they would stay at the I Hotel. And
Oh,
but mostly it was like work, and then you're traveling, you might know each other in passing and all that. But when they retired, that was when it became like community. So some of these elders, when they retired, they said, I'm going to just stay at the I Hotel, have a permanent apartment there instead of a temporary hotel. And at that point, they became more like family, where there was a lot, now you weren't working, you were retired. And so you get to socialize more, play games, talk story, cook together, uh, play pool, go to the restaurants. So that's what happened in their eldership. The community became even stronger.
and it was affordable back then too, right?
Yes, it was. Like you can survive on a social security check. And also Chinatown has always been reasonably priced, Manila Town and Chinatown, in terms of restaurants and
Mhm. Oh,
produce.
mhm.
So these elders could like have like a nice big Asian lunch for like, a couple dollars or something like that. Your dollar can stretch a long way.
Let's talk about your ancestor Fred. And he was a cook, right? And so at what point, if any, was he at all at the International Hotel, or he raised a family, so he was probably somewhere else, right?
Yeah, see, my family is very unusual because the majority of his generation were bachelors,
Mm-hmm.
and they weren't allowed to bring wives and children over, and they really couldn't never they found themselves in lives in which they never really could afford to go back home. So they basically
Mm-hmm.
spent their whole lives here. My grandfather started like that when he was about 17 years old. He comes to be a laborer with his three cousins, and they
Mm-hmm.
came, and he was at 215 Kearney Street in an SRO, but not 868 Kearney Street, which was the International Hotel.
Oh.
But he lived on that block, and he started off as a young man, and he was part of that migratory force that first went to Central California, for vegetables, and and would go up to the cannery, but he really hated um working for the farm. So and he didn't want to, he did one season of picking strawberries, he said, and he goes, he couldn't stand it. So
That's
he
too
so
backbreaking, right? Very,
so
very
what he yeah,
backbreaking.
very backbreaking. And he just said, I'm going to try to make it happen in San Francisco. So he started off from the very bottom, which was like busboy, in the restaurants of San Francisco, learned to become on the job how to cook, and then eventually became like was able to be a chef and a cook for his whole living. He was he was interesting in that sense, that he became a part of that generation that stayed in San Francisco and was a part of the hotel and restaurant community. My great grandparents came unusually early. That was not the mass. They were a minority, migration. But in doing that, coming as early as 1904 and having a child, they had one of the only female, very few female Filipinos that were in America,
Oh.
and and that's how they met. That
Mhm.
like my grandfather, I think, would have probably lived his whole life as a bachelor if he wasn't lucky enough to find a Filipino woman who was actually of the proper age living, in San Francisco, and that changed his whole life. So they got married, they fell in love, got married, and then they moved out of Manila town to start their family.
Mhm.
Yes.
Your grandmother's mother really didn't like your grandfather, right?
Yeah,
According
yeah,
to,
that
yeah,
was that was very interesting. It's almost a Romeo and Juliet
yeah,
story, because because back in those days, which is so funny now because we don't see it like that. They felt that the Cebuano people, that ethno-linguistic group, and the Ilocano people, that ethnic group, that's a mixed marriage. And they
oh,
and so the Cebuanos, they didn't want their Cebuano daughter to be with an Ilocano man. It's like that's a different culture. So she didn't like him for a long time. She wanted my grandmother to marry a nice Cebuano boy,
mhm, oh,
but love is love, right? So they
mhm,
really had Romeo and Juliet story.
mhm,
They eloped when they were 17. My grandparents, great grandparents, found them, dragged them back, and then when she turned 18, they said, well, it's legal, we're going to just get married,
mhm,
and then and then the story with my great grandmother and my grandfather is that one thing I keep always saying is that everything changes when a baby is born. And
Mhm.
that's what happened, is that she refused to talk to him or even, think that he existed
Mhm.
until the first grandchild was born. And then of course
Ah.
you fall in love with your granddaughter.
Mhm.
Then suddenly this is like this, okay, I'll keep this man too. He's my son, you know, and that's what happened. And they became closer after that than even between my grandmother and great grandmother. They were
Mhm.
like this, that he was truly a son to her. And that's part of our family story too, is that
Mhm.
babies make all the difference. Once a baby's
Mhm.
family now.
Wow. That's amazing. How did you, I know that you wanted to become executive director of the International Hotel because of the history, but how were you able to pull it off?
Well, to be honest with you, I think it was just one of those things where I didn't want to be the executive director per se. I just
Oh,
wanted to be involved. So
oh,
I actually I got involved in the advisory board just to sort of like, make sure that things were going well for the center. And then got on the board of directors. And then the executive director quit. And it was like, well, so we're the governing board for the organization. And so I said, well, I'll be the interim executive director until we find somebody. And that's like, oh, 7 years later. It's like, and I learned on the job. I had like really great mentors to sort of help me. And um, I kept thinking I'll be interim, but I fell deeper and deeper in love with the mission and with the community and it didn't interfere at all with my music, life. It, as a matter of fact, it enhanced my music life
Yes.
by being close to community. So
Yes.
so I just sort of see that, well, this is my life now, and it feels wonderful to serve in a more direct way. I love talking to the elders. I love talking to the babies. Like, families, whole families come through.
Mhm.
Um, and and I really feel like I'm contributing service to community, and that's a lovely feeling. Yeah.
Mhm. Yes. What about the oral history? Are you interested in, are you doing any oral history of the elders that are living there?
Actually, we are, because we're feeling that's a part of like our stewardship, is like
Mhm.
we're not archaic. We're not just telling the same story. We have to actually be reflective of the community today, and to also make our story interesting to the younger generation. So our archive, we are just finishing. After I talk to you tomorrow, I'm meeting with my coach who is helping me to direct my first documentary
Mm.
on but what I'm going to do is a documentary about the women of Manila town. So we always think of the elders were male. There were a handful of women, and some of them were young women, because when you were it was a tenant run movement. So outsiders couldn't be the leadership. You had to be a tenant to be the leadership of the struggle. And
Mhm.
so some young people, like university students, intentionally moved in so they could be a part of the leadership. And an even smaller group of women, young women, moved in. And so these women would go on, be evicted, and then go on and have human rights activist lives up until their eldership. And one of them is an evicted tenant as a young woman, Jeanette Lazam, who in 2021 came back to live as an elder at the
Mhm.
International Hotel. And her story is so interesting, and not the stereotype of what you think an International Hotel hero is, which you always think is an older man. So we're creating a documentary on her life and times, especially that now that she's with us, she's living with us again.
Mhm.
And she came back 40 years after her eviction.
How long was that struggle when the tenants were trying to keep from being evicted?
9 years. It was
Mhm.
nearly 10 years. And the classic film that was made, The Fall of the I Hotel by Curtis
Mhm.
Choi, that was 10 years in the making,
Mhm.
because, and he was filming throughout the whole time. No one knew what was going to be the outcome. And that story took 9 years to when they finally evicted them, because the protest was so strong, that, the fight against it, that it was staved off for many years.
And what was the reason that they gave for trying to evict the elders and tearing down the hotel? hotel in old and needed a lot of maintenance, or were they just greedy and then wanted to use that plot of land for development?
That's really it. It was like the landlord who owned the building. And you have to understand that back in those days, we didn't have the laws that we have now that protects, tenants, and that also has affordable housing, for low income people. So basically the owner, he said, it's my building. I want to evict them. I want to tear it down, and I want to build a parking lot that will
Oh
bring
yes.
lots of,
Hmm.
yeah. That's it. That's it. Does any owner have the ability to improve, the quality of the building with repairs? Absolutely. Did he choose to do that? No. He really wanted to tear it down and build a parking lot, and that was really the reason.
That's kind of strange because doesn't he make more money with the people living there and paying rent than having a parking lot?
Well, don't forget though, is that the SROs were affordable
Mhm,
housing. This is
mhm,
where, they paid like rent, their rent was like $50 a month.
mhm, mhm,
So it was where the elders could afford to be. So I could imagine for him, he was thinking, oh no, a double decker, like a multi-level parking lot. Oh, in a growing financial district in San Francisco, I'll make more money. That's
mhm.
pretty much what he thought, I'm sure. And it's probably true.
Do you know who the owner was? Was he also was he an American? Do you know, or was he Filipino or was he Chinese? Do you know who he
He
was?
was
Or is he?
actually it was a foreign owner, a
Or no?
Singaporean. He was no, and offhand, I don't have his name, but he was known as the Godfather, of Singapore, because he was a mogul.
Ah.
Like, so
Mhm,
he owned multiple properties, saw things in terms of money. So it was actually a foreign owner,
mhm.
in Singapore.
Did he own a lot of other land around that area as well? Do you know?
No, I don't know. That's a great question. I would think so, because what you have to understand is that Manila town used to be a village of 10 blocks. It was a long, a big village, maybe about half the size of Chinatown, uh, and then little by little it got chipped away, mostly because the owners of the buildings were going to change the buildings or tear them down. And so who knows who owned them, but by the time they got to that one block where the International Hotel was, that was when the community protested. But it
Mhm,
did get chipped away, mostly because the Filipinos didn't own the buildings. They just had
mhm,
businesses in the buildings. So when they kicked you out, and we only decided to get loud, when it was down to the last block. We should have got loud when they were shipping the hotel.
yes, yes. And also when they were chipping away at those 10 blocks, was it mostly businesses or were there also affordable units in those places as well, or rent control or do you know?
Both, both. So
Both.
so some of
Mhm,
them, so some of the, when you take away the businesses that make a community, like the pool halls, the restaurants, the stores, the nightclubs and things like that, you start losing the community. But
mhm,
there were also like a certain amount of them were also SROs, because this is where
mhm,
the community lived. So when you take away how they spend their time, how they eat, and where they live, you pretty much effectively decimate a village, and
mhm,
that's what happened. It wasn't intentional. It was more like greedy. I mean, no one said like, we're gonna, like, take the Filipinos out. No, it wasn't that kind of like a thought. But what it was that this land, as like Justin Herman, who was like one of the leaders at that time, said, this land that the Filipinos were on, right? This land is too valuable for poor people to live on.
mhm.
That's one of the famous quotes of Justin Herman, and that was really the sentiment. I mean, to say something like that now, that's just like, that's awful. But back in the days, in the 60s and the 70s, that, the attitude of the leaders at that time, they could just sort of say that out loud, that there was no value in poor people. The land was more important than the poor people living on it. So we just need to get rid of them and build some, make use of that land
Mhm.
with parking lots or office buildings.
Nowadays, when developers want to take over a building, sometimes the ones that are standing last are offered buyouts. Do you know if any attempted buyouts happen at the I Hotel?
Well, there weren't buyouts, from the tenants. No, they were just eviction notices,
Just
right? Yeah, but there were like eminent domain became an issue in other parts of San Francisco that, because we didn't have landlords of big buildings, we had people's homes. So in the Fillmore neighborhood, which would, what we now know as Japantown and the African American neighborhood of the Fillmore, they actually told people they had to leave their homes because of eminent domain and bought them out. That's also a sore point in our city as well, because that was also like how we lost a number of homes that were owned by people of color and businesses that were owned by them, that they were taken away so that they could build, develop in that area.
So it seemed as if that Fillmore also the land was more valuable than the people.
Yeah. Yeah, that we come from but here's the thing is that I would like to think, because I love my city, that we learn from that. That left such a bad taste in the mouths of your average San Franciscan, not the powers that be, but your average citizen of San Francisco, that you can't simply do that anymore. Laws have been passed since, there's more protection. Gentrification still exists, of course, but then it has to be a more slick kind of like way to get people out of their homes, and not so flagrant, like that, where they have no rights at all.
Well, Carolyn, Cabading, we enjoy your album Sugalanan very, very much, and we'll play it, and then we'll play it after this interview. And thank you so much. Continue your work, and I'm assuming that but all this history under your belt and all your creativity will be getting us some more very, very beautiful albums from you in the future.
Thank you, Trudy, and thank you for all the great work that you're doing in radio. It's like, just wonderful work that you're doing, and giving us all opportunities to be heard.
Thank you so much, Caroline. You keep up your good work as well. Thank you so much for all that you do.
Thank you.